Dear everybody, welcome to this third session in the Symposium Fiction and Reality Beyond Big Brother. I have the great honor to be the host and moderator for this session, to distinguished guests, and first and foremost to my old friend Eben Moglen. Eben is it was absolutely necessary to bring in this symposium for a reason that many people probably don't know here. But Eben was the first whistleblower at on these topics, or at least the one that made the most promoted the most advanced understanding of what was going on. And basically, during 2005 and 2006, there was a silent counter-revolution in the world of the internet and digital technology. Hosting videos and music and photographs, which was something that people were doing simply themselves or on a wide variety of platforms, suddenly became hosting them by millions on centralized platforms instead of peer-to-peer networks or distributed hosting. Even things like word processing became centralized for some minor benefits with things like Google Docs. Blogs and personal sites, which were the basic expressions of individuals on the internet and who were self-hosted or were hosted by a wide variety of platforms, suddenly were sort of buried while they still existed. They were sort of hidden behind the extraordinary growth of social networks that were collecting users and bringing them together as a mass to be made commercial exploitation of. And this happened without us, and by us I mean the communities of people who were promoting the internet as a tool for human development and emancipation, without us protesting, noticing even at the start. And then I remember a day in July or August 2007, and there was a debate between Eben and Tim O'Reilly at the OSCON conference. And in this talk, Eben, with his usual dynamism, gave to Tim O'Reilly what Tim O'Reilly described as a tongue lashing. And the real reason was the fact that Eben was stressing that we were heading for disaster. 3 years later, 2 years and a half later, Eben gave a talk at the ISOC New York called Freedom in the Cloud, and there he gave the whole explanation behind his initial anger. And today he is going to share, I hope, with us some thoughts of where we are of the movement in reaction to centralization and in reaction to the immense dangers it has brought and realities it has brought on us of mass surveillance. And he will do that with a specific attention to the context of movies, I believe, but also with, I'm certain, thought-provoking discussion of the future of where we are heading. You have another mic there.
So I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to thank the organizers for their very flattering invitation and for their extraordinary hospitality. Philippe is, as always, a very generous comrade and friend, and I'm very grateful to him for his introduction. To be reminded of one of the worst moments in my public life is a very good way to begin speaking now. Let us start, if we might, with the biggest of the ideas, and we'll get smaller as we go until such time as we are ready for the movie industry. The human race is building an external nervous system which will embrace within one generation every human being on the planet, and we will become a species connected rather than disconnected for the first time in the history of the human race. That network, that nervous system, has as its anatomy the thing we call the internet, and its physiology, how it functions, is made by software. What we are now engaged in is a single generation-long struggle to determine the nature of the species we are becoming. For our comrades, Philippe and Jérémy and others who have been working their long or short lifetimes on this problem, our hope was and remains that this network can be the bulwark of a new and even more extraordinary form of human freedom, in which every brain on earth can learn, and in which we accelerate human intelligence not by improving its quality a little bit, but by improving its quantity immensely. The network should provide us with the opportunity to allow every mind to learn whatever it wants, whatever it can hold, regardless of how rich or poor it is. And in such a world, we would create Einsteins and Van Gogh and philosophers and dramatists and poets and physicists without number. And by doing so, we would save the planet and the human race. And instead, we are building a machine that will make totalitarianism immortal. We are preparing to destroy the autonomy of human individuality. We are building a network that flattens what we have most cared about for the last precious 500 years in human history since we invented humanism and freed ourselves from the idea that each individual human being is captive to something larger than herself and beyond her control. How are we doing that? As Philippe says, we have made a crucial error in the anatomy of our neural system. Rather than using the technology to empower each individual human being to create, express, learn, and know in a free and individualist fashion, we are creating an anatomy of the nervous system which centralizes understanding of human behavior too far and in the wrong hands. It is conventional and proper to understand the problem now, thanks to Mr. Snowden, as primarily about spying, mostly by governments. And of course, in the end, this is the thing to be concerned about. Power will marry knowledge beyond the ability to control power, and it will know us too well, and it will control us completely. In a modern society, technologically well endowed, let's take the one in Europe I know best, the Netherlands, it now takes 6 seconds to find any human being in the Netherlands. 6 seconds. Because you swipe on and off the tram. Because you carry mobile devices that track you. Because if you are using an Apple Mac OS laptop, as you will have learned last week if you were paying close attention to the news, every time you do a spotlight search, whether on the network or on your own desktop, your precise physical location is being transmitted to Apple every single time. Consider what it would have been like here in this place if the Salazar regime had been able to find every human being all the time throughout the state in 6 seconds. Now, it isn't merely a problem of control, not in that sense, not merely a problem of listening and controlling. Because of those of my comrades who are here this weekend who are very radioactive from the point of view of the largest and most powerful empire in the world, this room here, where we are right now, is among the most surveilled places on Earth. More surveillance is concentrated on this conference this weekend than is presently being used to surveil the nuclear submarines of the Russian Federation, because some human beings are here, and those human beings are provocative to power. That's control. But I am more concerned with matters that stretch a little bit beyond that question of control. It is obvious that governments, for reasons of national security, have decided to eliminate anonymity of action. The conflict between anti-terrorism, which we could just call government control, and the freedom to act anonymously in the network is a conflict upon which governments, particularly that of my own empire, have decided there should be no relenting. Attribution of every action, an ability to determine who has done what, is crucial in their judgment to the preservation of their power. Hence the war on WikiLeaks, hence the war against Mr. Snowden's revelations and Mr. Snowden himself. I had a piece in The Guardian about 36 hours ago responding to the behavior of the British government, whose chief listener, Mr. Hannigan, had been saying in the Financial Times a week ago that the large American companies are facilitating terrorism. So 10 days ago, I wrote to Alan Rusbridger and I said, Alan, are you interested in my answering Mr. Hannigan? And Alan said yes, within a few hours. But by the time I had written the piece, the Culture Secretary of the UK had said that the right of privacy is merely a power for some well-paid lawyers to conceal the misbehavior of rich businessmen and the sexual indiscretions of sports celebrities. And the former Home Secretary, David Blunkett, who is in no position to talk about anybody's sexual indiscretions, said instead that any American company offering encryption is merely assisting terrorists to commit genocide. And by the time I got the piece out in The Guardian, I was attacking not just Mr. Hannigan, but the entire Tory government. That determination to eliminate anonymity and secrecy in order to attribute every human action to its doer is the root of autocratic and despotic government. But it is secondary to the real problem, which is the end of the anonymity of reading. When Philippe talks about the centralization, the fact that our pages and our tweets and our thises and our that's and our spreadsheets and our documents are all held in centralized places, what he really means is every time you read something, somebody's watching you do it. And every time you use those centralized social networks, you're helping them do it to other people. Every time you tweet a URL, it gets automatically shortened by Twitter, and they get the traffic on the shortened URL. So you say to other people whom you know, you should read this, and Twitter watches them read it. That's why tweet is there. Every time you send a piece of mail to some correspondent of yours through Gmail, Google gets a copy. Every time you put a thing on a Google Calendar, you're disclosing to Google the activities you and other people are planning to undertake. There was a meeting of 4 very important business people in Silicon Valley a couple of weeks ago that one of them described to me, in which 4 people from 3 companies, none of them Google, sat down together for a crucial business meeting. And one of the CEOs in the room began the meeting by saying, you know, my calendar's on Google. Google knows we're having this meeting. And 2 of the other people in the room congratulated themselves immediately and patted themselves on the back. Oh, they thought, it's okay, we carry iPhones. Apparently never having read the Snowden revelations in their Spiegel about the relationship between NSA and the iPhones. We poison other people's privacy by using these systems. We create an ecological difficulty. The companies like to think that what we're doing is making, or they want us to think at any rate, that what we are doing is making a bilateral agreement with them. For convenience, we give up our privacy a little bit. And everybody thinks, okay, well, it's very convenient for me, no big deal. But we're not. We're giving up other people's privacy. And the most important privacy we're giving up is the freedom to read anonymously. Without the ability to read anonymously, there is no freedom of the mind. Without the ability to read in private, the thing we call the Reformation could not have happened. And the continuing attempt by a centralized organization to control thought in Europe would have lived forever. The ability to read, and the ability to read in a space that belongs to us, no one else is in mortal danger. And every time you help someone else read something you consider valuable by pointing at it through some centralized facility, you are further degrading the ability to read alone. Not for yourself, not as a matter of convenience to you, but for other people in pure environmental indifference to the freedom that their minds seek. This is what Philippe means when he says that we have tried to blow a whistle since the middle of the last decade about what was happening. And before that, my comrades and I were busy trying to create the physiology of a free network using free software. That is, software everyone can read and understand and modify and change for themselves and for one another, thus ensuring that the physiology of the nervous system embracing humanity would not be centrally controlled. The most efficient despotisms of the 20th century collected vast amounts of information with which to control their people. And none of those despotisms, I lived in the Soviet Union when it was Brezhnev's place, none of those despotisms ever collected anything like the information now collected about you every day by a system of centralized information collection and understanding which is growing smarter and more comprehensive all the time. Intelligence services have a single purpose. They collect information about the capabilities and intentions of other things or people. The 20th century despotisms worked hard to understand people's capabilities, to understand what people knew, who they knew, what they might be able to do if they got together. But the possession of the Google search box enables the discovery of what you wish for, dream about, are thinking of, might risk. And in that box, the dreams and aspirations of human beings are collected on a scale of which totalitarian despotism could only dream before. We could fix all this, but it is getting harder with every passing day because people's habits are more and more ingrained. Why does this work? It isn't merely that the services are convenient. It's true that the services are convenient, though with the right software, we can make services that do not hurt you or the people around you as convenient as the services that you now use. The real reason that this is happening is that human beings love spying on one another. The real reason that this works is that the very systems which are spying on you and eliminating the anonymity of your reading are offering you tiny little opportunities to spy on others. And the dirty secret is that that's what human beings really love. So the services are giving you back a little bit of spying power, keeping track of people you would otherwise not keep track of, knowing about the love lives of people who might otherwise not be leading their love lives in your view, all the little bits and pieces of gossip that since primate beginning we have loved so dearly, are the real currency with which your complacency in the face of this system is bought. Regrettably, I say regrettably only because in this audience it will be regretted, regrettably, there is no industry on earth that has been more deeply complicit in the creation of this nightmare than the thing we call the movie business. This also has at its root a psychological rather than an economic reason. The very nature of the movie business is to offer you the opportunity to watch stories unseen while sitting in the dark. Primates are visual animals. We love to watch. We always have. We always will. But the possibility of telling stories that immerse you deeply in, shall I say it, the lives of others, while leaving you the disembodied, invisible watcher, the eye in the fourth wall, is an irresistible experience for human beings. And therefore, from the very beginning of the thing, the relationship between telling stories immersively for people sitting in the dark, watchers unseen, and the spying and controlling business are psychologically too closely related to be taken easily apart. But it isn't just that, of course. No business on earth has been more determined to control the neuroanatomy of the network for its own advantage at the expense of ordinary human beings than the movie business. We have been fighting since before the end of the 20th century the movie business's recurrent desire to get inside every computer and every screen and ultimately every cable connecting a screen and a computer in the world in order to prevent the leakage of the product. In the Republic of South Korea at the moment, due to diplomatic pressure put on by the movie business through the United States government, every single large file transfer in Korea is watched in real time by the Korean Copyright Commission. I have stood in the control room and watched them do it. Every single large file transfer in the entire South Korean internet is being looked at in real time by the South Korean Copyright Commission in order to understand whether some child is sharing a movie. And almost 10,000 young people a year are pulled in for what is known literally as copyright re-education school on threat of criminal prosecution for sharing culture. I am unable to find a nice thing to say about the industry that has accomplished that. Perhaps you can. I will say, of course, about that industry that it has depicted the problem, told stories about the problem. Francis Ford Coppola in 1974, in The Conversation, began the exploration of what it means to be a listener. Florian von Donnersmarck completed the activity in 2006 at just about the same moment that Steven Spielberg, after great and persistent research, gave us in Minority Report one of the most important facts about the system within which we live, which is that commercial surveillance comes first and government surveillance comes along behind. Mr. Spielberg was extremely acute in his depiction of that fact, after which he went back to making money and it wasn't his problem. Because, of course, that's the other thing about the movie business, right? It's the story arc, in which no matter how close we get to understanding the nature of power and surveillance and the ability to use human beings' desire to watch against them, that's never what makes a good fifth act in a carefully crafted, well-arced, after the story conferences and all the rewrites way of making the movie. And in the end, we're usually asked to sympathize with the listener, aren't we? Oh, yes, of course, various other terrible things have happened. Blood has come up out of a toilet, or there's been a hit-and-run accident, but in the end, it's the listener with whom we are to sympathize, because who else would the movie maker sympathize with but the spy? This is a crisis for a cultural icon, the thing we call Hollywood, Bollywood, this, wards of the state movie making that characterizes the European peninsula. But it's minor compared to the recognition that all of this, again, goes along with spying on you while you watch. Netflix is better than the theater. It's even better than Windows XP, which used to tell Microsoft every time you put a DVD in the slot which one it was. It's even better than the iPhone, which watches you as you watch whatever you're watching on it. Because what we do is to get you fully engaged in the idea that every piece of cultural consumption you undertake is monitored as you start and watches you watch it all the way through. At the end of the 19th century, we learned the most important thing we've learned about the human race since the Renaissance. We learned in the form of thinking we call Freud that the majority of human mental activity is unconscious. We have spent 100 years trying to come to grips with that reality, and we've done so far an incomplete job of it. But one of the great problems presented by the discovery that the majority of human mental activity is unconscious was to make a science out of that discovery. We argued for much of the 20th century about whether Freud had accomplished scientifically investigating that phenomenon, that truth, because the only available evidence that could be gained if this was a science was by personal introspection and therapeutic dialogue between subjectively engaged parties. And the idea that this created a science of the unconscious was not uniformly accepted, to say the least. Big data revolutionizes human social science. When you capture all of human behavior all the time, everything, what you do, what you wish, what you think, what you share, how you travel, where you go, how long you stay, how you read, when all of that is data captured and stored in memory forever, nothing is lost, nothing goes away, nothing is forgotten, then of course the majority of what you're capturing is unconscious activity made flesh. Big data observation doesn't distinguish between your conscious activity and your unconscious activity. It gets it all. And it compares it all with everybody else's. We are about to find out quite a lot about the human species in an undeniably scientific way. And what we are about to find out is what no one has any business knowing ever. Because the consequences for power and the consequences for the order of culture of a world in which all of our unconscious activity is fully captured is a world in which there is no such thing as freedom. None. This is not any longer a debate about whether God gave us free will or determined our behavior. This is about whether the machines know us better than we know ourselves and who the machines work for. And the answer isn't us. Of course, the Wachowskis have made a movie about this too. I mean, they made one good one and two bad ones, but they made movies about this. But once again, the story arc is towards the love story and the hero's journey from innocence to experience by blowing things up, and the usual metaphorical mess, which is the movie business view of the human condition. But it's there. And by being there, like Scheherazade's stories, it prevents us from coming to grips with reality for yet another day. It's a sham. It wouldn't be a good sham if there weren't some truth in it. But it wouldn't be a sham at all if it told the truth, and if it did tell the truth, there would be no tomorrow like today, and we would do something. And most of us aren't Mr. Snowden, and we would prefer not to risk it, and so we don't. I said spying and the movie business are inseparable, but I just wanted you to come and be ready for a fight. What I really mean, of course, is that we are becoming a species whose integration into spying on ourselves has taken a quantum leap in an evil direction. And we have a very short time in which to fix it before we bequeath to our progeny a world in which we would not live. Tens of millions of people died here in the course of the 20th century in order to prevent a world in which the state listened to every phone call and paid attention to what every troublemaker thought. It is glorious to stand in a society which has known unfreedom and made itself free. And it is horrible to watch that process reversed by an insidious thing that people can touch and feel and smell but not understand. We are there now. And whether we get ourselves out or not depends upon the commitment that we all have. Technologists have special roles, lawyers have special roles, culture makers, storytellers too. And we're not any of us doing very well at it. We have a great deal more to yearn for by way of reversal of the mistakes that we have made. But trillions of dollars now depend upon the continuance of those errors and the consolidation of that power. I hoped it was, I will confess, I hoped, deeply I hoped, in the beginning of my career in doing this, that we would come to a stage at which the network was powerful and the state began to wither away. I will confess my dream. But that's not what happened. The state has not withered away. The power of the people to share and learn and grow has been reversed. Since 2001, for reasons essentially trivial, the Reichstag burned or something like that, we have equipped the states to penetrate the net at levels that are beyond human safety in every way. My government, essentially romantic, essentially amnesiac, essentially determined upon the exercise of righteous power for human good, because no government on earth watches movies with the same degree of heartfelt vigor that my government does. My government has made this worse because it has exported the procedures of totalitarianism around the world. Because it has empowered not just itself, but every other state to some extent to play this nasty game at a higher level than it could ever be played before. When the now ex-Indian government announced about 20 months ago that they would create a content monitoring system which would take the content of every telephone call and SMS in India, Indians by and large laughed. They said, well, you would love to, but this is India. You can't do it. You're not strong enough. 14 months later, it was finished. Because the Americans no longer build dams and air bases in countries, they build surveillance infrastructure. Booz Allen Hamilton, the actual employer of last employment for Mr. Snowden, Booz Allen Hamilton is now Bechtel. We build around the world the imperial products, and in the 21st century, it's not concrete, it's optical stealing. But it isn't just my state, of course. It isn't just my state. The importance of Mr. Snowden's revelations were that the Americans had stopped applying the rule of law to listening. But no government in Europe has ever applied the rule of law to listening, ever. And as my dust-up with the UK government last week suggests, even the one most likely to talk about the rule of law won't actually implement it. They will instead announce that it is obsolete or even evil for companies to say that we will do what the law requires, but otherwise we will shield our customers from you. So it is true that the great problem right now is the public power. But below the public power lies the private centralization of data, the centralization of knowing, the complete corporate control of what you wish for. From an economic point of view, this is just about advertising. But from a sociological point of view, this is about reversing the Renaissance, eliminating humanism, replacing the idea of the individual's sacred and indefinably precise right to read and think as one soul alone, with a perfect system of connection, which knows what you mean by what you want before you do. Next time you type something in the search box and it offers you a drop-down of the things you likely mean, consider what that implies. If you've stopped going to confession, the search box is where you confess. And there's no absolution for what you say there. It would be good to make movies about that. Don't bet on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eben. Thank you, Eben, for this dense and thought-provoking talk. We are going to take questions and comments on this talk, but before that, I would like to do what I should have done before, to present you with the other panelists in this talk. One of them I'm actually not totally in a position, so I will offer you to present yourself. To my left is Jennifer Robinson. Jennifer Robinson is known as one of the lawyers of Julian Assange. But as you have just noticed, there are lawyers who like to think in depth about the universe in which they are defending their clients. And she does, and I hope she will share some views also about what is the ecosystem of whistleblowing that we need, and the one we have now, what are the various roles of people and organizations in it, and something which we tend to consider as a kind of cloud without much differences, and we need more understanding of that. Further on the left is Eric Sadin. Eric is a literary author and a non-fiction writer. He has written 2 books on surveillance, but I think he will share us some ideas from free. Well, the third, at least, he's going to share us some views about the one he's now completing, and ideas about next generation surveillance that will, I think, steer some debate about whether by reacting to the forms of surveillance that we have already experienced. We are not fighting, trying to shoot an already obsolete target. And I hope we will have an interesting debate on that. And then if you may, I'm sorry, this is unprofessional.
No, absolutely no problem. So I will present myself in English, and I don't know if the room is more Portuguese speaking or English speaking. My name is Rui Tavares. I'm from Portugal. I'm from here, from Lisbon. I'm an historian. Formerly, I was a member of the European Parliament, working on in the LIBE committee, which is the Civil Liberties Committee of the Parliament. I've worked on the SWIFT case, also on the PNR case, on passengers' names records. And at the end of my mandate, I was appointed rapporteur on fundamental rights and the rule of law in Hungary, which is actually one of the countries that where the rule of law and fundamental rights and democratic values have deteriorated the most in Europe the last, especially 5 years. And professionally, I am an historian who works on 18th century issues, mainly censorship and enlightenment.
Thank you. I think we need a few translation devices so everyone can speak in one's own language. Some of us have them, but I don't. And I think Eric neither, or maybe doesn't them. Now, we'll now take questions and comments on Eben's talk. Maybe we cannot take all of them because don't worry, there will be other questions and comment sessions during the panel.
Miguel Sebastião, português. Sobre o seu discurso, eu penso que, embora haja muita coisa que hoje é diferente, dados os meios que existem, não é muito diferente das ditaduras do passado. Hoje vive-se muito nos meios digitais. Se a gente for olhar para a história do Sr. Edgar J. Hoover, ele fez com o que havia na altura e com as formas como as pessoas comunicavam, falavam e faziam as suas reuniões e a sua vida, ele controlou muita coisa sem meios eletrónicos, com meios digitais. O mais sofisticado que havia eram telefones analógicos fixos e a radiocomunicação, quanto muito. Portanto, eu parece-me que a tentativa de dominar sempre existiu por controlar, pelo escovilhar, pelo saber a vida dos outros. Não é muito diferente do que era hoje. As coisas, se calhar, é mais subreptício, mas não propriamente muito diferente do que foi no passado. E evidentemente explora-se muito esta questão humana. Agora, eu penso que há aqui uma situação que se está a dar hoje, como se deu no passado, que é quando a polícia deixa de ser só polícia e passa a ser também política. Ou seja, a polícia, em vez de cumprir ordens democráticas ou ditatoriais do Estado, passa ela própria a tentar intervir nos processos que conhece. Há algumas histórias caricatas sobre a antiga polícia da ditadura portuguesa, porque eles usavam muitas vezes a informação julgando que estavam a fazer um grande serviço e os assuntos eram meramente irrelevantes. Até eles escutavam os próprios dirigentes do regime e pessoas ligadas e afetas ao regime eram escutadas e às vezes pequenas escovilhices, pequenas piadas uns sobre os outros eram transmitidas aos membros do governo se alguém dizia que um determinado membro do governo era burro. E até era amigo dessa pessoa quem dizia isso e portanto eu penso que isto acabará por... A oposição a isto e esta, digamos, incapacidade de avaliação de tanta informação que hoje as polícias têm, ou as NSAs deste mundo, acabará por, como se mostra no caso do terrorismo, eles não conseguiram apanhar muita coisa que aconteceu, apesar de terem aqueles dados todos. Portanto, eu penso que isto acabará por... Eu penso que está-se a dramatizar muito hoje quando isto já aconteceu no passado. Não sei se concorda comigo, mas a questão é esta. Acho que o que está a passar hoje já aconteceu no passado de uma forma ou de outra e foi derrotado.
After a while, quantitative change becomes qualitative change. So let me respond to what you've said by saying that the difference between the information collection and retention powers of despotism in the past and the present is in the beginning a difference of scale. In the world of 20th century totalitarianism, there had to be targets. You could know who you were spying on. In the world of 21st century technology, targets no longer have to exist. The entire country, the entire society, the entire human race can be surveilled at once. Consider what makes Facebook useful to secret police. Secret police are people. They just want to meet a lot of people. They have categories of people that they want to meet. Sources, adversaries, and influenceables, that is, the loved ones of adversaries you can torture and the people to whom you can apply pressure to create sources. They know what they want, but they don't know who. The beauty of a thing like Facebook is you have data on 1 billion people, and it can be mined. The relationships among the data points can be discovered without knowing where you are looking. Where identifies itself. The utility of Facebook to the secret police of the world is not that you can get data out. It's that you can put code in. And so you run in what a technologist would call the business intelligence layer atop the Facebook data warehouse. You watch in real time the lives of 1 billion people. You are no longer in the attic listening to the man downstairs whom you know you are investigating, pressuring his influenceable to get closer to him. You are in the attic of the human race, watching everybody, the lives of all others, to find what you are looking for wherever it may be. This is not the behavior of despotism in the past. This is not even the behavior of the largest thought control organizations in the history of the world, like the Catholic Church. This is a behavior which goes beyond that in every direction. It begins as a quantitative change. And so for us as historians, we begin by saying, yes, we have seen this before. But our role as historical sociologists is to explain why what we have seen before is not the same as what we now have. And if we can get other people to see the difference, we can make them active rather than passive in their fate.
We will take another question now. Then we will let every member of the panel also have their say on what Eben has mentioned. I'm sorry, I saw another hand there. But you get your word later.
First of all, I'd like to react a little bit on the movie business part. Once you said, I think there's a big difference between, there is a big element on anything that we're watching. I think there's a big connection of it's the television that is monitoring us. So there's a big level of spying and of trying to find out everything that's going behind that camera, behind that screen. But as well, there is the way I live cinema is very much also connecting to more of the person who has actually made, through the thoughts and all that. So a bit different from spying, but more through empathy with the fiction that is created. But this was a part. Now I wanted to ask you a question on what level do you think there is such all this information is being used? At what level do you think the corporations or the governments are able to crush and direct a little bit of society niches and society itself as a whole? I don't know, it's a bit of a vast question, but...
Yeah, let me begin by saying that I spoke not about cinema, but about the movie business. we could address the difference between cinema and the movie business this way. When I can share the video, you have cinema. When I can't, we have the movie business. So that's easy, okay? We can get rid of the whole problem. Let's just allow sharing of the video, okay? And then we will be much closer to the world you're talking about. Let me point very briefly to your second question only. After 2001, a bad man, Rupert Murdoch, decided to make it easier for the US government to torture people. He created 24. It was.
Okay, I suggest now we have a round of each person in the panel. In reaction to Eben's talk, but of course this will be based also on their personal thinking. I see Eric Sadin being quite impatient about it, so please give it a start.
Alors, est-ce que ça marche? Oui. Merci Philippe, hein, merci Eben. Je préfère m'exprimer en français, je pense que ce sera plus fluide. Alors, est-ce qu'il faut que j'attende un petit moment pour que les... Non, ça va? Donc, hier, je parlais avec le camarade Jérémy Zimmerman qui disait qu'il fallait un peu ouvrir des perspectives et ne pas avoir une narration trop sinistre ou trop dramatique à ce qui se passe actuellement, essayer d'ouvrir des perspectives. Certes, tu as raison Jérémy, mais voilà, ce matin, en prenant mon petit déjeuner, j'ai noté quelques petits points, j'en ai 6-7, donc ça va prendre quelques minutes, qui synthétisent 15 années de réflexion. Donc je vais essayer d'être bon, de bien synthétiser les choses, et de marquer, alors de dire qu'à la fois, je suis 100% d'accord, évidemment, avec ce qu'a dit Erwan, 100% d'accord, et en même temps, je suis tenu de marquer une distance. Parce qu'il me semble qu'ici, et à juste titre, nous parlons de surveillance de gouvernement, de surveillance étatique. Et effectivement, nous savons depuis un moment, depuis Duncan Campbell, hein, à la fin des années 80, l'importance du réseau échelon, ce même Duncan Campbell, qui à la fin des années 90, à la demande de l'Union européenne, a établi un rapport sur la surveillance de masse étatique, gouvernementale, principalement américaine et avec le réseau du Commonwealth. Et les autres pays ne sont pas en reste, mais le rapport ne portait pas sur ces pays-là. Donc nous le savons parfaitement. Nous avions les moyens déjà de le savoir. Et c'était un whistleblower aussi, ce monsieur Campbell. Hein, il y a même un livre qui est paru en 2001 en France. Hein, il a été traduit dans beaucoup de pays. Nous avons été plusieurs, et certains d'entre nous sont présents ici, à avoir signalé les choses massivement au cours de la première décennie du XXIe siècle, hein, le fait que les gouvernements, il y avait une sophistication de la capacité des agences de renseignement à s'adosser aux compagnies privées. Les compagnies privées qui ont été les premières instances de récolte de données et qui, à la différence de ce qu'on voit dans le film de Coppola, par exemple, n'ont plus besoin de dépêcher des agents. Les agents des agences de sécurité sont en pantoufles, n'ont plus que s'adosser aux câbles et aux tuyaux et à récupérer les données. Mais les données, elles viennent d'où? Elles viennent de nos comportements, de notre assentiment, de notre agrément. Et cet agrément, cet assentiment, il est récupéré d'abord par les compagnies privées et ensuite par les agences de sécurité. Et parfois dans le cadre du droit ou parfois sans un cadre légal. C'est ce que nous a montré de façon emblématique un héros des temps modernes, Edward Snowden. Hein. Mais, et là je vais marquer un petit distinguo, un tout petit distinguo. Je me permets de parler de moi une seconde, ce sera la première et la dernière fois, je l'espère. Les révélations de Snowden, 5 juin, certains disent 6, moi je notais 5 juin 2013. Greenwald, Petras, Snowden, 5 juin, tremblement de terre. Dès le 18 juin, j'ai proposé au Monde, le journal Le Monde français, de publier une tribune, qui a été une tribune qu'ils m'ont laissé la place. Hein, et j'ai expliqué que on pouvait s'offusquer, que cette pratique était hautement répréhensible, hautement, et qu'il était temps que ces pratiques-là soient, et des choses que nous ne savions pas, la puissance de profondeur, la puissance de collecte, mais que cela, finalement, au lieu de nous offusquer un mois de juin 2013, hein, si nous avions vu, et nous aurions dû voir, et nous devons voir, qu'il ne s'agit que d'une forme de banalité de la surveillance contemporaine, ce qu'a révélé Edward Snowden et ses quelques compères qui ont relayé les informations. Ce n'est qu'une forme de banalité intensifiée, sous une forme intensifiée, hyperstructurée et d'instance étatique. Or, que se passe-t-il actuellement? Il se passe qu'à mon sens, et je m'explique sur ça dans mon prochain livre, enfin, notamment sur cela dans mon prochain livre qui va paraître en mars, je pense que la surveillance numérique, gouvernementale, a connu son âge d'or de 1995 à 2015. Je m'explique. La surveillance, telle que nous l'entendons ici majoritairement, je vois bien que nous ne l'entendons pas seulement exclusivement comme cela, mais ce qu'on nomme la surveillance numérique, comme captation d'informations relativement aux individus, relativement à des structures collectives, interceptées par des instances étatiques, désormais, cette capacité, cette masse d'interception devient marginale. Elle devient marginale au regard du seuil qui s'opère actuellement. Et là, je vais m'expliquer très simplement. J'entre dans le deuxième partie de ce que je comptais exposer aujourd'hui. Nous entrons aujourd'hui, 2015, je ne suis pas futurologue, les années qui viennent, nous passons un seuil. Et quel est-il ce seuil? Eben l'a évoqué. Je dirais le nom des big data, mais je dirais plus précisément le fait que notre environnement quotidien est de plus en plus imprégné de capteurs, d'objets connectés, qui, hors nos navigations, hors nos communications qui témoignent de nos pratiques, vont témoigner de nos gestes, bon gré, mal gré, en continu à l'intérieur d'une continuité spatio-temporelle de l'expérience. Et cela va induire une captation des informations à l'égard des individus et à l'égard des organisations par quantité d'organismes privés qui, alors bon, certes, ils connaîtront les comportements, certes, ils les connaîtront de façon encore beaucoup plus approfondie. Mais l'enjeu de la surveillance, ce n'est pas tant de savoir qui fait quoi. Et c'est cela aussi que je voulais évoquer très rapidement aujourd'hui. L'enjeu de la surveillance n'est pas de savoir qui fait quoi, c'est d'exploiter la connaissance des comportements à des fins commerciales. Et personne ne regarde précisément qui fait quoi. Ce n'est pas l'enjeu. Il ne faudrait pas se tromper sur le nouveau paradigme de la collecte de données qui n'a qu'une seule visée prioritaire, évidemment étatique. On peut espérer qu'il va y avoir des digues. Je vais terminer sur les digues juridiques qui ont été ô combien défaillantes au cours des 15 dernières années. Mais la surveillance, aujourd'hui, ne constitue pas, en tous les cas, on pourrait presque... voilà, moi je pense que nous passons de la surveillance numérique à ce que je nomme le data panoptisme. C'est-à-dire que les données, aujourd'hui, nous ne cessons de témoigner de nos existences et savoir qui fait quoi par des groupes économiques qui sont les premiers à collecter les informations regardant les individus, savoir qu'il est là, mais ils s'en fichent complètement. Ce qui compte, c'est la revente de des informations hyper personnalisées à des fins commerciales. Et que se passe-t-il ? Que se passe-t-il à l'intérieur de ça? Eh bien, je suis tenu d'en appeler à la notion foucaldienne de Michel Foucault de gouvernementalité, c'est-à-dire de pouvoir. Hein. Le pouvoir, si nous entendons les gouvernements comme les instances premières de pouvoir, eh bien peut-être, j'ose ici me permettre de dire que peut-être nous nous trompons. Peut-être que nous nous trompons et nous manquons la cible principale qui veut que c'est le monde technico-industriel, au sens de gouvernementalité de Foucault, c'est-à-dire qu'est-ce que la gouvernementalité en un mot de Foucault? C'est la capacité de certaines personnes à agir sur le comportement d'autres personnes. Alors on voit bien que quand on donne ces définitions très très simples, hein, c'est-à-dire non plus un rapport frontal, mais d'identifier là où s'opère quantité de jeux de pouvoir dans le quotidien, eh bien le monde numérico-industriel est devenue une instance majeure de pouvoir dans la capacité à influer sur les comportements et aller jusqu'à déterminer le cadre de la perception. Alors déterminer le cadre de la perception, évidemment, je pense à la mesure de tout ce que je viens d'expliquer très rapidement là, à cette abomination, à mon sens. Je viens d'écrire une tribune qui est parue il y a 2 jours dans Le Monde sur les Google Glass. Alors voilà ce que je nomme dans mon jargon, c'est le chapitre de mon prochain livre, un chapitre, la vérité NSA du monde. La vérité NSA du monde. C'est-à-dire que moi, avec mes lunettes, mes Google Glass, j'en saurai beaucoup sur vous, en temps réel, vous en saurez beaucoup sur moi, j'en saurai beaucoup sur mon environnement, mais non pas parce que, je termine dans 2 minutes, Philippe, je te vois bouger, non pas parce que ce que je vois correspond à une réalité objective, mais parce que reviennent vers moi des informations en fonction de mes comportements hyper individualisés et qui accompagnent mon existence. Alors on voit bien qu'avec ce monde numérico-industriel qui a de plus en plus gagné en pouvoir et qui de plus en plus agit à l'abri de tous les discours enthousiastes sur l'Internet, le monde de données, les big data, tout ce monde extraordinaire, ils agissent à l'abri. Et pourquoi ils agissent à l'abri? Parce que nous sommes entrés dans un monde de ce que je nomme du back-office. Le back-office étant cette configuration qui permet de régler les paramètres. Nous sommes dans un monde du back-office dans le monde technico-industriel, c'est-à-dire sans théorie du complot, il y a une capacité de faire les choses sans que nous n'ayons aucune connaissance. Et à la mesure de ce que je dis, la connaissance de la façon dont les choses se font, qui détermine nos actions de plus en plus, qui détermine nos perceptions, la connaissance de la façon dont s'opèrent les choses. Je termine en 1 minute, Philippe. Ah bon, cette connaissance-là, évidemment, et Eben l'a évoqué, et évidemment, à la Quadrature du Net, Philippe, Jérémy et bien d'autres défendent cette idée impérative de free software, c'est-à-dire de connaissances partagées de la façon dont les choses sont structurées par les compagnies, non pas par les agences étatiques, et qui créent des effets de gouvernementalité dont le summum, dont le pic va être les Google Glass, parce que c'est la perception humaine. Donc, pour terminer sur cette très rapide balayage que je fais sur notre temps présent et ce qui pointe et ce qui va ne faire qu'intensifier, parce que Jérémy, mon camarade Jérémy, hier, disait il va falloir donner un peu de perspective. Il est difficile d'être porteur de bonnes nouvelles actuellement à la mesure de ce qui se passe. Surtout que le monde politique, ce qu'on doit constater, c'est qu'il s'opère une troublante collusion, c'est le terme français, est troublante et très problématique, collusion entre le monde politique et le monde numérico-industriel. Je fais référence au mouvement actuel des smart cities et de l'open data, qui veut que c'est par l'accord du politique, parfois avec des budgets publics, avec l'agrément des élus, et dans le monde entier, et en France de plus en dans le monde entier, il y a l'accord tacite à revendre des données publiques en vue de quoi? Eh bien, la servicisation du monde, la mise sous service de tous les champs de la vie par des applications, et donc la marchandisation de la vie publique qui ne fait l'objet d'aucune controverse ou débat public à la hauteur des enjeux. Et je termine là, Philippe. J'ai écouté, horrifié, le monde, la collusion politico-numérico-industrielle. Là, il y a des jeux de pouvoir. Et ce n'est pas seulement les agences étatiques. Il y a des jeux de pouvoir. Quand j'ai entendu le président de la République française, la semaine dernière, lors de son intervention télévisée, dire comme ça, le fait du prince, sans aucune concertation, sans aucune controverse, la notion démocratique de controverse, d'opposition, de délibération, eh bien que le président de la République française, François Hollande, a décidé lui seul, sans aucune concertation, qu'à partir de la 5e, donc à l'âge de 12 ans, les écoliers à l'âge de 12 ans, allaient tous être dotés d'une tablette numérique, sans qu'il y ait d'évaluation, d'études d'impact. Et vous imaginez, quand on parle de connaissance des personnes, les nouvelles modalités de connaissance des élèves et des professeurs qui vont s'instituer. Alors, comme je suis un peu hyperactif en ce moment, j'ai encore écrit une tribune, un texte qui va paraître dans le journal Libération mardi, et je terminerai, mais vraiment, face à la démission du politique, face à l'inertie du société, face à la gadgetisation le rapport de gadgetisation que nous entretenons aux technologies numériques, qui sont des technologies cognitives, c'est à une nécessaire repolitisation de nos rapports aux technologies à laquelle nous devons en appeler, à une nécessaire repolitisation. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, repolitisation, à mon sens? C'est-à-dire d'évaluer la portée politique, sociale, anthropologique du rapport que nous entretenons avec les technologies numériques. Et à cela, je ne vois, en tous les cas aujourd'hui, quand je dis face à la démission du pouvoir politique, je dis aussi face à la démission du pouvoir juridico-politique, non pas des législateurs, ou une forme de démission, ou une forme d'inertie. On n'a pas le temps. Tu disais que tu avais travaillé à l'Union européenne. J'ai été auditionné à Bruxelles l'année dernière. On n'a pas le temps. Je ne vous raconte pas ce qu'on m'a dit. J'ai été horrifié. L'Europe, hein, non pas à Washington ou à Pyongyang, hein, à Bruxelles, capitale de l'Europe, hein, Diderot. Je ne vous dis pas, je n'ai pas le temps, peut-être si vous me posez une question, je ne veux pas occuper de temps de parole, mais je n'ose pas vous dire ce qu'on m'a dit quand j'ai parlé de certaines exigences que je souhaitais formuler, hein, qui me semblaient impératives. Bon, alors je m'arrête là sur ça. Donc face à cette démission du politique, du juridico-politique, et face à ce que je viens de dire, le type de rapport de mise sous gadget de nos rapports aux technologies, oui, je ne vois, il n'y a, voilà, y a-t-il d'autres issues? S'il y en a, face à cette connaissance de plus en plus approfondie de tous les comportements individuels et collectifs, pas seulement détenus par la NSA, non, prioritairement en vue de l'exploitation commerciale, c'est surtout cela, à mon sens c'est surtout cela, et bien face à cela, et face à le fait que ce pouvoir d'infléchissement ne cesse de s'étendre, hein, évidemment, la prochaine étape étant évidemment les implants sous la peau, donc on imagine jusqu'à quel point la connaissance et des comportements à l'intérieur d'une continuité spatio-temporelle de l'expérience, mais aussi la profondeur de connaissance de l'humain, eh bien, voilà, que pouvons-nous faire actuellement que d'en appeler à une réappropriation des technologies, hein, free software, et sous bien d'autres formes aussi, et à une politisation par les citoyens, par les associations, par toutes les forces vives des sociétés, repolitisation de ces enjeux et prise de conscience de leur portée éminemment cognitive, politique et sociale.
Merci Eric. En réalité, nous aurons l'occasion, je l'espère, dans la suite d'explorer à fond dans nos échanges ce que tu as présenté comme de possibles désaccords, dont je ne suis pas si sûr qu'ils soient des désaccords, mais il est certain en tout cas, il y a un point qui est sûr, c'est que probablement ce qui nous réunit tous les 5 ici, c'est le souci de la politisation des choix techniques et l'absence de confiance dans le fait que les industriels ou les gouvernements spontanément auraient les bons choix en la matière. Donc on reviendra à cette question, mais je suis sincèrement reconnaissant du fait que tu nous aies obligés à une pensée projective et non rétrospective. Mais je voudrais rebondir sur ta conclusion en demandant d'abord à Rui Tavares et ensuite à Jennifer Robinson, qui sont évidemment pas sans doute les prototypes, ni l'un ni l'autre, d'une confiance aveugle dans le politique, qu'il soit législatif ou juridique, mais quand même de répondre à l'espèce de diagnostic positif et de nous dire quelques mots de comment ils voient les rôles respectifs de l'action citoyenne distribuée, Noam Chomsky dans ce que nous avons écouté hier, et qui parlait beaucoup de la gouvernementalité et pas seulement de celle des États, disait que l'espoir ne réside... Il disait d'abord « It is in our hands and nobody else ». Mais il disait également que seule l'action diffuse pouvait et vraiment transformer les choses. Mais donc je propose que Rui Tavares commence avec votre expérience de législateur. Entre parenthèses, j'ai une sorte d'expérience de législateur moi-même comme membre de la commission parlementaire numérique de l'Assemblée nationale, qui me conduit plutôt à partager le diagnostic d'Eric Sadin. Mais que pouvez-vous nous dire là-dessus?
Okay, donc, je vais vous donner quelques secondes pour mettre les casques, pour que les non-lusophones mettent les casques. Posso começar? Vou falar então em português. Eu mantenho como hobby, como passatempo, sempre que tenho algum tempo para isso, ler jornais e revistas antigas. E tenho estado a ler os jornais de há 100 anos atrás. Não há provavelmente nenhum momento tão fascinante numa cultura mediática que já era próxima da nossa, de seguir, do que aquele momento entre de maio, junho, julho e agosto de 1914. Porque a transição de uma Europa muito parecida com a nossa, feita dos escândalos cotidianos com as celebridades. A França, na altura do atentado de Sarajevo, estava preocupada com o assassinato do diretor do Figaro por a mulher de político, um político do Partido Radical, e não pensava em mais nada. Pensava naquele julgamento de celebridade que ia acontecer e nem deu pela notícia de que o arquiduque tinha sido morto em Sarajevo. Em Portugal, as primeiras notícias acerca de que havia ali um assunto sério são de 25 de julho. E poucos dias antes, o que se dizia nos jornais em Portugal era agora que a situação orçamental está controlada, é uma coisa que faz sempre sorrir os portugueses, agora que a situação orçamental está controlada, vamos construir uma marinha. A 26 de julho começam a aparecer as primeiras notícias de que a Áustria e a Sérvia estavam a fazer exigências demasiado, digamos, demasiado ultrajantes uma à outra, e de que a Rússia não ia ficar para trás. 26, 27, 28 de julho, a situação está delicada. Aproxima-se a grande conflagração europeia. 31 de julho aparece em Portugal a notícia do assassinato de Jean Jaurès, portanto, de um dos últimos homens em quem se confiava na Europa para convencer os trabalhadores da Europa da altura a não fazerem guerra, a fazerem greve geral e não participarem na guerra dos imperadores e dos banqueiros, ou seja, deste complexo que é estatal e é privado ao mesmo tempo. 1 de agosto de manhã, os jornais na altura tinham muitas vezes duas edições, edição da manhã, a situação está calma. Na edição de 1 de agosto à tarde, a situação está perigosíssima. Bem, e depois sabemos todos o resto. Portanto, em poucos dias, aquilo a que se assistiu foi ao colapso da promessa europeia. Uma promessa europeia que, ao contrário do sonho americano, que está muito bem formulado e explicitado, e todos os políticos, cineastas, escritores, publicitários se referem a ele, essa promessa europeia está muito implícita e pouco formulada. Mas eu gostaria de explicitar um pouco, porque ela repousa em 3 fatores. O primeiro, prosperidade partilhada, não é? Que era a grande demanda do movimento socialista, sindicalista e até de partes do movimento liberal na Europa daquela altura. Em segundo lugar, direitos fundamentais para todos, que era a grande demanda, por exemplo, do movimento sufragista, das feministas, mas também das minorias étnicas que havia em todo o lado na Europa, não é? E que continuaram a haver. Húngaros na Roménia, romenos na Hungria e por aí adiante. Em terceiro lugar, soberania popular, ou aquilo a que cada vez mais chamamos de democracia. E em poucos dias, eu diria, em poucas semanas, isto colapsou em cima de um mundo que tinha um aspecto de mundo normal. Tanto que os generais das potências beligerantes foram apanhados, já estávamos no verão, foram apanhados a passar férias nos países inimigos. Portanto, havia generais austríacos que estavam na França e alemães e franceses que estavam na Alemanha e tiveram, ao abrigo daquele cavalheirismo europeu da altura, tiveram que voltar rapidamente aos seus países para começarem a fazer a guerra. Não foram feitos prisioneiros lá nas estâncias balneares da Europa. Eu creio que a grande ameaça que nós temos à liberdade na Europa e também no mundo é ainda esta grande ameaça clássica. Portanto, não negando a importância das duas outras grandes ameaças à liberdade que eu vejo e que tentaria resumir agora, para depois voltar à clássica. A primeira é aquela que nós podemos chamar da vigilância de baixa intensidade e baixo foco. Ou seja, toda a gente é vigiada todo o tempo e isto é absolutamente generalizado. Blanket surveillance. As nossas, no caso SWIFT, no Parlamento Europeu, nós identificámos que 90 milhões de transações bancárias que passam pela rede SWIFT na Europa todos os meses são partilhadas com os Estados Unidos. E de antes era ilegal, agora há um tratado europeu que conseguimos derrotar uma vez, não derrotámos na segunda vez, porque houve uma aliança entre socialistas e conservadores no Parlamento Europeu para fazer passar e liberais também, para fazer passar esta vigilância. Portanto, 90 milhões por dia. São a pequena transferência que o pai faz para o filho que está a estudar num Erasmus noutro país da Europa. São cidades inteiras, regiões inteiras, cujas transações financeiras todos os dias são enviadas para o Departamento do Tesouro em Washington e são, embora os Estados Unidos neguem que façam data mining daqueles dados, evidentemente que o fazem. Se não fazem no Tesouro, fazem depois ao lado na NSA. Bem, os dados de passageiros de avião. E somos vigiados exatamente como no filme do Spielberg, em pré-crime. Portanto, a ideia é que se a gente vai, no PNR, se a gente vai passar um fim de semana em Nova Iorque, mas leva mais peso do que seria natural, porque, sei lá, porque o namorado ou a namorada está em Nova Iorque a fazer o doutoramento e levamos uma mala de livros, isso é o suficiente para sermos vigiados de outra forma do que se não levássemos tanto peso, porque é estranho levar tanto peso por um fim de semana. Claro que isso, quer dizer, acaba por nunca apanhar os terroristas que preparam os seus atentados, mas apanha-nos a todos nós, todos os dias. Na Austrália, o serviço de vigilância nos aeroportos da Austrália disseram-nos uma vez que faziam vigilância reforçada a toda a gente que não tinha um nome no cartão de crédito que condissesse com o nome no bilhete de avião, que fizesse mudanças de planos à última da hora e que tivesse estado em países perigosos. Eu ouvi aquilo, claro que eu seria vigiado, porque como todos os portugueses eu tenho 5 nomes. E, portanto, o nome nunca condiz no cartão de crédito, no bilhete de avião, no documento, é sempre diferente. Ao contrário de noutros países onde as pessoas têm só 2 nomes e esse problema não. A primeira vez que fui aos Estados Unidos, a pergunta foi: Why the fuck don't you have 2 names like everybody else? Porque os portugueses têm 5 nomes, os portugueses, os brasileiros, etc. Em segundo lugar, faço mudanças de planos à última da hora e tinha estado na Síria, portanto, em trabalho pelo Parlamento Europeu. E, portanto, toda esta gente é vigiada. Só que, na verdade, e esse é o nosso drama, ninguém se incomoda, ninguém se importa. Porque acontece a todos nós, acontece todos os dias, acontece com coisas que todos nós fazemos todos os dias, e algumas pessoas vão estar muito preocupadas com isso, mas 100% da população dificilmente estará. Portanto, 100% é vigiado, mas é vigiado naquilo que a pessoa percepciona, sente, erradamente talvez, mas sente como sendo 1 ou 2% da sua vida e que ainda por cima é uma vida prática. Nós todos queremos viajar, queremos consumir, etc. Ok? E, portanto, é difícil, embora se tenha tentado muito, os piratas tenham tentado muito, o Anonymous tenha tentado muito, casos como o do Snowden, jornalistas como o Greenwald tenham tentado muito, é difícil que a minha mãe, que tem 83 anos e mora numa aldeia no Ribatejo, ou outras pessoas, se levantem para lutar contra isto. Depois existe o outro tipo de ameaças à liberdade, que são de alta intensidade, mas também um foco muito alto. O que quer dizer que, ao contrário da primeira, que prejudica uma porção que nós julgamos razoável porque convivemos com ela, a vida de toda a gente que tem uma vida confortável e burguesa nos países desenvolvidos, prejudica totalmente 100% da vida de um número muito reduzido de indivíduos. Um tipo que se chama Mohammed qualquer coisa e que tem um nome parecido com um terrorista e que é apanhado e enviado para uma prisão secreta e é torturado e depois é largado no meio de um país qualquer quando finalmente descobrem que era o tipo errado. Bem, lá no Parlamento Europeu também trabalhamos nestes casos. Estas pessoas têm toda a sua vida completamente danificada a partir daquele momento e para o resto da vida, para sempre. É completamente diferente do primeiro tipo de ameaça, que é uma ameaça de baixa intensidade a toda a gente que tem uma vida mais ou menos urbana e burguesa. Só que estas pessoas são 0,0001% da população. Portanto, alguns ativistas de direitos humanos vão se preocupar muito, mas também 100% da população não se vai preocupar tanto, ou vai se preocupar quando houve a história. Ou as tais pessoas que eu fui visitar na Síria. Na altura a Síria recebia refugiados, agora a Síria produz refugiados. Isto foi em 2010. Estavam ali crianças que estavam há anos no campo de refugiados, que não iam poder estudar, que não iam ver mais nada do que deserto e tendas, e que justiça seja feita, os Estados Unidos recebem 80 mil dessas pessoas por ano e a Europa recebe 5 mil. 5 mil. Em toda a Europa, 28 países europeus recebem 5 mil refugiados por ano. E existem 160 mil por ano nesta situação. As vidas deles estão destruídas, mas são 160 mil pessoas num planeta de 7 mil milhões. Ok? Os que tentam vêm para o Mediterrâneo, morrem no Mediterrâneo, são umas centenas por ano, em face a um continente de 500 milhões de pessoas que acham isto terrível, acham isto um escândalo moral, mas são 500 milhões de pessoas que todos os dias seguem com a sua vida. E aqui há uma coisa em que eu discordo do que disse o Erwin. Na Europa, nós não lutámos a Segunda Guerra Mundial contra Estados que vigiavam tudo. Incidentalmente, nós lutámos contra Estados que vigiavam tudo o que as pessoas faziam, mas a guerra lutou-se pelas velhas razões clássicas das guerras. Quer dizer, a guerra começou porque a Alemanha tinha invadido a Polónia e porque antes tinha invadido os Sudetas. Mas, quando finalmente os vários países da Europa e do mundo puseram as suas máquinas de guerra em confronto umas com as outras, não foi por causa da vigilância. Depois usaram isso como argumento para destruir os totalitarismos. Mas a guerra começou pelas velhas razões clássicas. Conquista territorial, guerra, chacinas, fome, repressão a trabalhadores, etc. Pronto. E aqui eu chego ao que é a terceira ameaça para a liberdade, a tal que eu acho que é a clássica. Vou usar uma imagem que pessoas do mundo da cultura e das artes entenderão. É a imagem do falsificador, o falsificador de pinturas. Hoje em dia, dificilmente nós teremos ditadores no mundo desenvolvido como tínhamos durante as grandes tragédias do século, ou pelo menos eu não os antevejo nos próximos 5 anos, digamos assim. Ou talvez até nos próximos 10 anos. Mas teremos pessoas que sabem muito bem imitar os indicadores da democracia, imitar os indicadores da normalidade e, no entanto, deteriorar o Estado de Direito. Então, este é o caso do Sr. Orbán na Hungria. A União Europeia, a certa altura, inventou uma checklist para os tribunais para entender quem é que tem um bom sistema judicial ou um mau sistema judicial. Quais é que são os tribunais que demoram muito em todos os países e quais é que demoram pouco. A Dinamarca tinha tribunais que funcionam muito rapidamente, para um caso normal de direito privado, 1 mês está resolvido, ficou no início da tabela. Portugal tem tribunais que funcionam muito mal, demora 3 anos para decidir um caso privado normal, entre 2 indivíduos, e ficamos no topo da tabela como um país que funciona muito mal, desse ponto de vista. O Sr. Orbán, na Hungria, garantiu que a Hungria ficasse exatamente no meio da tabela. Porque se demorasse muito tempo, as pessoas iam desconfiar, iam dizer, há ali um problema de Estado de Direito. Se demorasse tão pouco tempo como na Dinamarca, as pessoas iam dizer, casos em tribunal que demoram pouco tempo na Hungria, quer dizer interferência política. E, portanto, fez o esforço de se pôr no meio da tabela, exatamente como um falsificador de uma pintura, que vai fazer com que tudo naquela pintura esteja correto. A cor, a pincelada, o traço, os materiais, etc. Tudo aquilo vai ser muito semelhante a um estado de normalidade democrática, numa sociedade onde há consumo, numa sociedade onde há alguma liberdade, numa sociedade onde, quando as pessoas são despedidas, nunca é por censura, é porque simplesmente, digamos, a ditadura de baixa intensidade neoliberal faz com que nós sabemos que as pessoas são despedidas todos os dias, etc. Estes tipos vão continuar assim nos próximos anos. E vão sempre obedecer às regras do Estado de Direito enquanto isso lhes der jeito. Vão fazer como fazem os nossos burocratas em Bruxelas, que são puramente procedimentais. Pegam no livro de instruções, seguem as instruções todas, ao fim do dia está tudo certo, porque seguiram as instruções, não há mal nenhum. O que é que falta neste mundo? E aí eu discordo também do Erwin. O que falta neste mundo é um discurso unificado que possa juntar as nossas várias lutas. Eu acho que a gente não vai conseguir fazer nada face a estes Estados e a estas empresas enquanto estiver segmentados entre gente que está obcecada com privacidade, gente que está obcecada com a ecologia, gente que está obcecada com direitos laborais, gente que está obcecada com direitos culturais, etc. Aprendamos com a lição dos nossos antepassados, de gente como o Jean Jaurès e outros, que o que fizeram na altura, há 100 anos atrás, foi, em vez de ter lutas que são segmentadas de especialistas, um discurso democrático mais ou menos unificado, que permita aí sim mobilizar, não ali os ecologistas, ali os ativistas do Anonymous, ali os ativistas da precariedade, mas juntar toda a gente pela conquista desta tripla promessa, que aliás não é só europeia, é mundial. Prosperidade partilhada, para que ninguém viva na miséria, direitos fundamentais para todos, especialmente para as minorias em cada um dos nossos territórios, as minorias são variáveis, são sexuais, étnicas, etc. E em terceiro, democracia ou soberania popular. Isto precisa de um discurso unificador e aí eu tenho alguma esperança que a arte, e o cinema em particular, possa fazer esse discurso unificador. Porque tudo o que eu vejo no mundo da política, da legislação, das ciências sociais ou das ONGs é especialização. Há especialistas em direitos humanos, há especialistas em privacidade, há especialistas em direito de género, há especialistas. E a democracia não sobrevive com especialistas, a democracia precisa de generalistas e, portanto, precisa de reencontrar a sua unificação de discursos segmentados que de antes ideologias como o socialismo e o liberalismo tinham e que hoje em dia ideologias da privacidade por si só e mais nada, da ecologia por si só e mais nada, não têm. Muito obrigado.
We will come back to later to the issue of what's the next step in surveillance and how much it matters to consider fully this new stage in which surveillance is embodied in our bodies. Actually, it's encapsulated in our bodies, and in a way, it works. Eben explained that surveillance was building up using our taste for spying on others, but now we have new forms of surveillance that is building up on our taste for spying on ourselves. And that is something which is, we have for once to deliver the counter discourse before it's too late, because we have failed many other times. Now, just before, we have been very rude with the only woman in this panel by not letting her speak until now. But just a quick reaction on your Hungarian example, because nonetheless, you know, after a total failure of the European Commission, DG Justice and the Council, and in a way, an inefficiency of the Parliament to fight against the offense against fundamental rights in the Orban regime, their media law, and things like that. In the end, it is a totally minor attack on the internet by the Orban regime that has at last delivered us a mass movement inside Hungary. And why is it the case? It is not because of a €2.30 per household tax. You know, it is because this was considered as the wish to destroy the last tool of coordination and collective action that was still available in Hungary.
Just a quick point on that. I think Orban overstepped there. And governments do overstep, you know, once and again. In Portugal, it was because of a social security tax. They changed something, you know, also a minor change on the social security tax, the part that the worker pays and the part that the boss pays. And we had 1 million people on the streets. And in Hungary, it was the internet tax, it could be another tax. They had much worse than that. For instance, when they were drafting their new constitution, they changed the old constitution 12 times, drafted a new one, and then changed the new one 5 times. And they made this social consultation that really looked like democracy. Everybody got a leaflet at home where they could, put ideas for the constitution. And this leaflet had a code, a barcode, and your address and full name. You could, with a regular barcode reader in your phone, you could discover the address and name. I've done it with my own cell phone of, somebody, anybody in Hungary. And some people did answer to that. Some 100,000 people, I don't remember the exact name. And with that data, one can speculate, and I'm fairly convinced that it was used to, redistrict the electoral circles in Hungary, because you have lots of data about what people think everywhere in the country, and then you change the way the electoral, constituencies are made, and then you ensure the second 2/3 majority that Orban had, which was not conquered the same way the first one that he had. And with that 2/3 majority, then you can, again, change the electoral law and constitution and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that there was a failure on that. I think it's ongoing. I think you're not going to win a fight with a forger of democracy like Orban with one single step. You're going to have a long withdrawn war that is being fought every day, that the European institutions are also fighting, and sometimes you win it by, telling the Fundamental Rights Agency of the Union, or telling Viviane Reding, who was the former Justice Commissioner, don't go for those indicators of, the justice scoreboard or whatever, because they are meaningless. They won't tell you anything about Orban. What we need in Europe is a constitutional court for the Union that will make the states behave. We need what we call a Copenhagen Commission, which will be a place where you won't have independent, very prestigious people that, it could be Robert Badinter from France, it could be Mary Robinson from Ireland, but people who could, who cares? I think that you will need people, you need one thing. You need one thing to win these battles. You need wisdom. Indicators don't give you wisdom. It's just outsourcing, for somebody else to tell you, with this threshold in rule of law, you don't have rule of law anymore. You need also classical tools like constitutional courts with people that people know about, that are well known in the rest of the continent, that are prestigious, and that will say, now it's too serious, we are pressing the button, and the other politicians have to act. But I think, once again, that Mr. Orban also overstepped in something else. Now he is Mr. Putin's ally, and that is putting him in a very bad position inside the European Union, and now is weak inside the European Union. So ultimately, he will lose.
Thank you. Jennifer, I have not only you have waited long to speak, but I'm going to put forward a question which is not an easy one, is that legal fighting, it always serves the interest of a client, but there is always another agenda behind it, which is winning something for the future. So could you say a few words about what it means for you to conduct a legal fight such as the defense of Julian Assange?
I'm very pleased that Eben mentioned the war on WikiLeaks in his rousing talk earlier, because it is a war. But you have to ask the question about why is it a war? Why is there a war against WikiLeaks? And having been at the forefront of it, I'll talk about it a little bit. And I think you can answer that question in the same way if you ask the question, why is there mass surveillance? Why are governments collecting this much information on us? And that's because information is power. And the reason WikiLeaks is so threatening, why is a group of activists, why is Julian Assange, who was traveling around the world with a couple of laptops in his backpack, sleeping on people's couches, so challenging to governments? Because he threatened their control over power. And WikiLeaks threatens their control over information, which is power. Jeremy put it beautifully in the panel earlier today, Jeremy Zimmerman, saying that WikiLeaks writes the imbalance of power around control of information by making information available to us, because while governments control information, they control the narrative. And that's why WikiLeaks is so important. But consider, I think people forget, go back to 2010, and this explains why I feel so strongly about continuing to defend Julian, and I continue to be a member of his legal team pro bono. People forget because of the reaction to Snowden what happened to WikiLeaks. But back in 2010, just before when WikiLeaks were about to release Cablegate with their media partners, before it was the global story that it became, we went through a period of 3 weeks where his personal bank accounts were shut down. An Interpol red notice was issued for his arrest for allegations in Sweden for which he still has not been charged, and which he'd remained in Sweden for more than 5 weeks to answer, on the eve of the publication of Cablegate. They cut off all access to funds to WikiLeaks, an extrajudicial financial blockade, MasterCard, Visa, PayPal. It was a wholehearted attempt to shut down this organisation. And it wasn't just about this case in Sweden. You had the US government, the US Attorney General, Eric Holder, come out and say that they had opened a criminal investigation into WikiLeaks, and if they couldn't find a law under which to prosecute him, they would create one. Retrospective application of criminal laws doesn't seem to be a problem. And that criminal investigation is ongoing into WikiLeaks. There is a grand jury, we know that it's ongoing. And it's seeking to, we think Julian is a target, and is seeking to prosecute him for his publication of material and his actions as a publisher. And I think it's really important that we make this distinction, and this was a question that I think you asked me at the outset, which is to make the distinction between WikiLeaks as a publisher and Julian as an editor, and sources like whistleblowers like Snowden and Chelsea Manning. And it's important to understand that distinction, because I think it gets elided, and it gets elided in quite dangerous ways that affect the fundamental free press protections that we have. So one of the most fundamental free press protections we have around the protection of journalists is that journalists must be able to protect their sources in order to ensure that people keep coming forward to give us the information that we need to understand what's going on in the world. Now, why is that so important? That's important because we don't have protection for whistleblowers to make public interest disclosures. It's important that we make that distinction, because someone like Snowden or Manning had an obligation to government to protect that information. Now, of course, there's a huge public interest in them disclosing that information, and they ought to be protected for disclosing that information. But the journalists and the publishers who receive that material and publish it have not previously been subjected to criminal investigation for publishing that material. And by eliding that distinction and trying to somehow say that WikiLeaks is not a publisher, is somehow not protected by the First Amendment in the same way that mainstream media organisations are, is a watershed, and it's a very dangerous precedent for the press around the world. I think in respect of what we've seen, obviously Julian is still in the embassy, in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, having been granted political asylum because of the concern that we have, and his real fear about what would happen to him should he be extradited and returned to the United States to face prosecution. Sorry, I speak too fast as an Australian, and the translators are giving me a hard time. The danger that we see with the use of the Espionage Act in relation to these kinds of cases is that it's being used, legislation that was designed to capture people giving information to foreign governments is now being used against both whistleblowers, and of concern is one of the provisions under which the WikiLeaks grand jury is operating, is now being used for people that are giving information to the press in the public interest. And what's very concerning about that, and why Snowden should remain in Russia and should not return to the US to face trial, is that it's effectively a strict liability offence. So the fact that he gave this information in the public interest, the fact, even if he can prove that no damage was done to the United States, even if he can prove he did not intend to harm the United States and did not intend to communicate this information to foreign governments, it was specifically for the US, for US citizens to understand the illegality of their government's actions. None of that matters. It's effectively a strict liability offence. And I think that's a great concern, and one that I think people ought to think more carefully about when we talk about Snowden and his legal position. And just a couple of points about surveillance and the law, and I think it's something that we all ought to recognise, is that mass surveillance means that effectively each of you, all of us, are being treated like criminals. Once upon a time, in the not so far distant past, governments required reasonable suspicion before they could access that kind of information about you. Now they're doing it without a warrant, without any suspicion. They're treating all of us like criminal suspects. And this now, for me to sit up here and to say they ought to be getting a warrant for that information, they ought to show individualized, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity before they can capture that information. That's considered now a radical position. And that was and is the legal position under domestic law in most jurisdictions. And it has been a fundamental civil right. That position now is now considered radical, and I think we have to think very carefully about the ramifications of that. In terms of how do we hold these people to account for the surveillance that's going on, not only are we seeing that the oversight mechanisms, for example, the FISA court in the US or the Investigative Powers Tribunal in the UK, fundamentally incapable bodies. They don't have the powers, and for example, the IPT in the UK has never found against the Secret Services in any complaint that's been brought before them for the surveillance that's been undertaken. But worse than that, what we learnt from Snowden is that through information sharing and the ability of governments to surveil foreigners without warrant means that they can completely undermine domestic protections around and the laws that we have to protect us against unwarranted surveillance. And so what this requires is an international agreement and international reaction, because while that kind of information sharing is going on, and while that kind of completely unaccountable surveillance is going on, for example, of me as an Australian representing Assange, if I'm in the United States, they can capture everything. Even when I'm not in the United States, the United States government can take anything they want about me, everything about me, without a warrant. Then they can go and share it with the Australian government or the country of which I'm a resident, the United Kingdom. And they have all that information without ever having to get a warrant about me or on me. We now know that GCHQ surveils correspondence of lawyers. What does client-attorney privilege mean if they can access all of that information? What does it mean to be able to protect your sources as a journalist if they can access all that information? And fundamentally, we don't have legal responses to this. There are cases before the European Court right now about the illegality of GCHQ surveilling journalists in particular and their ability to communicate with sources. But I'm not sure what the outcome is, and I'm not sure what the response should be, and I think these are the bigger questions we should be talking about.
Thank you. Now, we have about 45 minutes left in this session. I'm going to give the floor a bit to people who raise their hand now. But I would like that we do not leave without giving some consideration to two questions. If really there is a new age of surveillance that is building up, let's say, bootstrapping itself on the present one to do something worse, like Eric has explained, and I saw Eben moving his head in ways that suggested that he agreed to his description. What do we need as a narrative to prevent it or limit the way it happens? And there can be maybe, Eben and I believe you too explain that these new forms of surveillance, they build up on some things that are deeply inscribed in our ways of behavior. But then, is it possible to develop a narrative that brings forward things that build on the same thing, but with good effects? That is spying on others, you know, but there is another thing which is paying attention to others. It's not the same thing, but it builds on the same resources. Spying on yourself, or I mean, measuring, being all the time preoccupied with the quantification of yourself. This is something that looks bad, but building yourself as an individual, trying to get a good life, this is, so which way should we go? Should we go the way of just saying, don't do it, it's evil? And we are fighting against the springs that gets people moving in adhering to these new efforts, or should we do other the way? I'm actually wording the question in a biased manner there, but so I stopped doing it. And the second question, well, when will it be enough? So I have you and Jeremy, and I know there are many other hands, but let's start by taking the two questions, and then we will have time for a round of everybody. But please stick on the issue that I have brought forward. I use my moderator power for forcing you.
Eu vou fazer primeiro uma primeira questão. Uma questão não, um acompanhar do que acabou de dizer. Eu vivi 10 anos na Hungria. 10 anos não, eu há 10 anos que viajo para a Hungria e vivi 2 anos na Hungria, assim é que é. Eu estive na Hungria em 2002 e vi as campanhas eleitorais do Orbán a decorrerem. E vi o que é que eram capazes de fazer e vi as bandeiras e as suásticas modificadas à maneira do Jobbik, que é a extrema-direita. Portanto, eu conheço mais ou menos e tenho estado a acompanhar o que se tem estado a passar nestas últimas semanas em Budapeste e tem sido realmente preocupante. Eu não sei se entendi mal e procurou tornar isto suave, mas o que eu detenho de lá é que realmente é uma situação complicada. Esta situação da internet é mais um ponto, é algo que se via desde o tempo de 1939, estamos a falar de uma situação de extrema-direita, portanto estamos a falar de um país que consegue colocar só naquele país que é do tamanho de Portugal, com 10 milhões de habitantes, temos uma extrema-direita fortíssima, amiga dos chineses, amiga dos russos, do Putin, que são eles próprios extremistas, que querem acabar com a internet. Portanto, eu daqui só consigo ver, não consigo suavizar. Os relatos que eu tenho lá também não são suaves. Vai haver uma manifestação na COSUT agora ao pé do Parlamento no dia 17, acho que é amanhã, enorme, vai ser como a outra, portanto está-se a preparar algo em grande para Budapeste. Essa era só a primeira questão. E a segunda questão tinha a ver com o primeiro interveniente e tinha a ver com o seguinte. Eu sou estudante de Sociologia e tenho o erro de me ligar muito a determinados conceitos e é a base do meu estudo. Eu vou referir alguns conceitos e vou tentá-los explicar um pouquinho. Não vou demorar muito na minha questão. É a seguinte. O pânico moral é um conceito que é definido por um pânico exagerado que dá origem a uma sociedade de risco. Portanto, eu quando tenho pânico de algo, vejo a minha sociedade como um risco e tudo me faz medo. Este pânico moral é-me difundido, isto são conceitos desenvolvidos, maioritariamente por duas entidades. Uma delas é os mídia e a outra são os políticos. Temos aqui políticos, temos aqui pessoas que trabalham em cinema. A minha questão é, não deveriam, os políticos eu sei já à parte, mas como isto é um festival de cinema, não deveriam os mídia e o cinema, que também está dentro destes meios, ter um papel mais responsável no cinema que faz? Michael Moore já falava de alguns dos filmes, de algum pânico moral que existe nos Estados Unidos. Cinema mais consciente, vá. Não criarmos em muitos filmes, eu habituei-me, vou fazer 40 anos, habituei-me a ver filmes em que os árabes eram todos maus. Portanto, Hollywood teve muito esse papel e continua a ter muito esse papel. Portanto, a criação de pânicos morais, criar sociedades de risco, que é para termos todos medo, que é para haver muita vigilância. E pronto, e acabei. Thanks. I'll try to be short. I spoke too much today already. And I think my question is not half as interesting as yours, Philippe. In what we plan to do to take back control of the situation, we feel the urgent need to get those intelligence organizations under democratic control. I don't really know if they ever were, and I don't know if they ever will be. Do you think there might be a way to achieve this objective? We know that for targeted surveillance, we can think of ways including the supervision of the judicial authority, some retroactive control and mechanisms like that. Can we do this for the general spectrum of action of our secret services and what is politely called intelligence communities?
The restoration of the rule of law over listening in the United States is possible. I don't think at the moment it is likely. I think that both presidential candidates in 2016 will be pro-surveillance politicians. I don't think we are, in the near term, going to restore the rule of law over U.S. listening, but I do think it is possible. By the time we have succeeded in restoring the rule of law over U.S. listening, the listening conducted by the Chinese Communist Party will be at approximately the same level of sophistication around the world, and the problem's political dimension will have moved. By that time, I think there is a finite probability that the French Fifth Republic will have collapsed, and that another form of despotism will be seeking its way in Europe. So I'm not convinced that there is a simple answer to this question. I do not think that the re-empowerment of the European elite is a successful solution to the problem. The problem of the democracy deficit is why European republicanism is already in substantial danger. I think that the question, as you and I would be inclined to see it, would be, can we use technology so as to force the democratization of politics through the democratization of technology? This is the path that we were on before 2001. What happened was that organs of power, as we would have said in Russia in the old days, organs of power realized that the democratization of technology threatened them in every direction. The security services of the world used to consider one another to be their primary adversaries. Now they consider their primary adversaries to be you and me and Julian and Edward Snowden. In other words, the democratization of technology presented them with the difficulty that they had to be prepared to withstand us. At the present moment, they are doing it very well, but they will not succeed in continuing to do it. All the fuss that was being made in the UK last week about how American companies offering encryption are facilitating terrorism is, as I said in The Guardian, actually carefully orchestrated kabuki. They need those companies. If those companies were replaced by decentralized technologies, they would have a much harder job listening than they have now. So they are at one and the same time beating up on the great data miners in North America in order to force them, blackmail them into cooperating, at the same time that they must allow trust in those companies to be maintained so that they can continue to use them as the immense data repositories that they are. This is the primary weakness of current French foreign policy, for example. The French come to Washington and they say two things. First of all, we need to be protected against the GAFA conspiracy, Google, Amazon, and Facebook. Your companies are bad. The second thing they say is you're giving people too many rights. Every terrorist in the world carries an Apple computer because it's safe, and everybody has First Amendment rights to do terrorism at Google. This reflects both the pitiful nature of the French government's unsophistication, but it also reflects the difficulty we are moving to, in which the companies are identified as American tools, not tools for all the secret police of the world, undemocratizing technology. So where you and I have been going for all our adult lives together is where we still need to go. We need to democratize technology further. We need to decentralize it further. We need to teach people how they can use a safe set of technologies that are really, really good instead of an unsafe set of technologies that are really, really good. That would be nice in Budapest, that would be nice in Washington, that would be nice in Australia. The nice thing about the technology is that it is culture neutral to that extent. If we democratize the technology enough, we will force them to democratize their responses. At least that's my working principle. I think it's yours. I think it's ours. We're doing okay with it, but we're late. We worked for 30 years to make free software so that we could secure free society. By the time everybody in the world heard Mr. Snowden on why that was important, we were already behind the score because people had moved to their devices. Now, I need to be responsive to Philippe's question. I can't in friendship leave it alone. One of the things which is happening now is that people are learning to put fitness monitors on their wrists, which report their body states to a centralizing company. We had an earthquake in Northern California 6 weeks ago, and one of the fitness bracelet companies began releasing the result of their data mining post the earthquake. How many people in the earthquake zone woke up when the earthquake happened? How long did it take each of them to go back to sleep after the earthquake happened? Whose physiological behavior the following day showed that they were still frightened or worried about the earthquake? If you take that body data and you let a third party have it, you're basically wearing a lie detector everywhere you go for your whole life. Your pulse, your heartbeat, your body temperature, your sweating, all of that stuff. The people who think that polygraphs aren't good for lie detecting are correct. But the reason polygraphs make poor lie detectors is the sample is always so small and it's too controlled. Once you start wiring up people's bodies to the net, you are doing a whole lot more than you think you are. In the 20th century, Andy Warhol said, and he was right given then centralized media technology, that everybody would get 15 minutes of fame. That's not enough. What a thing like Twitter allows you to do is to have 15 milliseconds of fame every 15 minutes. And that's a much more powerful drug to drop into the system of the human being. This is what Philippe means when he talks about our desire to spy on ourselves. We can't walk by a mirror without looking there to see our reflection in it, and we keep hoping that we look better in there than we think we really do, right? Those of us who are undead and cast no shadow in the mirror, we are lucky. We don't see ourselves there no matter how hard we look. But everybody else is very worried about whether we appear good enough. And what the network is doing is asking you to wire yourself up more and more to it so that you will occasionally catch a favorable view of yourself in the mirror that is watching you. This is the real meaning of selfie culture, right? The NSA documents released by Mr. Snowden on the subject of the iPhone come from a presentation inside NSA called So Your Target Carries a Smartphone, in which the point was, when you are trying to follow a human being, look at that smartphone first. A lot was said there about BlackBerry, but the real payload was about iPhone. The first slide at NSA about iPhone showed Mr. Jobs' face and said, "Whoever thought Big Brother would look like this?" And the second slide in the NSA presentation was taken from above through the glass roof of an Apple store at all the customers down below, and it said, "And who would thought the victims could be made to pay for it?" Right? The third slide was a slide which Der Spiegel redacted, which was a picture taken by a world leader sitting in his own living room on his own couch with his iPhone. They didn't want to say it was Mr. Blair, but it was. What happens, after all, in selfie culture is we are rewarded with an occasional positive snapshot for tracking everything we do for someone else. And this, the urge to spy on ourselves, as Philippe put it, is where the big data moment at which we cross into giving our unconscious away without ever understanding it ourselves comes from.
I want to give the floor to Eric first, if you allow, because he has he raised sort of the issue that we are trying to address. But is there? I want to add an inch of a question, which is the only narrative to prevent it from happen fear?
Très bien. Très bien. Ben, c'est exactement à cette question que je comptais répondre, Philippe. Je pense pas que je pense pas que ça soit du tout une question de narration. Peut-être certains d'entre vous connaissent cette assertion de Gilles Deleuze qui disait que le droit était vraiment c'est un des honneurs de la condition humaine, enfin de l'humain. Mais il y a la jurisprudence aussi. La jurisprudence, c'est-à-dire de ne pas avoir prévu en amont et qu'il y a des cas de figure qui obligent soit par des requêtes de citoyens, soit par des décisions de juges qui ne sont pas des législateurs, qui n'écrivent pas des lois, qui voient au quotidien, dans les tribunaux, ils se disent il y a des vides, il y a des creux, des vides que n'ont pas su voir les législateurs. Eh bien, je renvoie par exemple à la question que tu posais, par exemple, Jérémy, et la question que tu poses, Philippe, exactement, au 14 mai 2014, Cour européenne de Luxembourg. Cet Espagnol dont j'ai oublié le nom, j'ai oublié quelle bêtise il avait pu faire, je crois qu'il avait une dette, tout le monde connaît cette histoire, hein. Il avait une dette que je crois qu'il avait... Enfin bon, il avait été condamné pour quelque chose, j'ai oublié son nom, et il se plaignait du fait que quand on tapait son nom sur Google, les requêtes faisaient référence à quelque chose qui avait été réglé et pour laquelle il avait payé sa dette à l'égard de la justice. Bon, décision de juge, car il y a une démission. Moi, je laisse tomber encore une fois de plus la NSA. La NSA, tout ce qu'a révélé Snowden est éminemment répréhensible. Comme les services secrets français, comme les services secrets de tous les pays du monde, les Russes ne sont pas en reste, et les Chinois ne sont pas en reste, et plein d'autres pays, et les Saoudiens ne sont pas en reste, et les Qataris, et les Iraniens, et les Israéliens, et les Portugais, et tout le monde n'est pas en reste. Je m'éloigne à nouveau de la NSA, et je reviens sur une nouvelle classe, très rapidement, vraiment très rapidement. C'est le jeu, nous n'avons pas le temps de développer suffisamment les choses, c'est comme ça, c'est l'exercice. Je reviens sur ce que je nomme la classe des ingénieurs. Les ingénieurs qui s'arrogent un pouvoir et qui piétinent le droit avec leur rêve d'adolescent de vouloir changer le monde, l'esprit libertarien de la Silicon Valley, qui a dévoré le monde entier et qui piétine le droit, qui piétine les acquis démocratiques historiques, qui ne payent pas les impôts là où leur activité s'exerce, qui veulent construire même des îles dans le Pacifique pour s'affranchir des lois nationales et qui développent leurs protocoles à l'abri des regards parce que c'est structurel, ce n'est pas la théorie du complot, parce que le computationnel, les algorithmes sont invisibles à la perception humaine dans toute leur étendue et dans tout ce qu'elles règlent. Alors à propos des ingénieurs, je viens maintenant, et une fois de plus très rapidement, aux individus. Car nous, individus, non seulement nous sommes surveillés certes par la NSA et consorts, et toutes les autres agences, mais en plus nous nous quantifions maintenant, quantified self, c'est-à-dire tout notre quotidien, nos sommeils, nos données physiologiques qui induisent non seulement une privatisation de la santé, mais un autre régime qui est en train de s'ériger de connaissance des individus. Et en plus, ça ne suffit pas, on le partage, vous savez, cette idéologie du sharing, où on ne peut plus maintenant faire un geste sans que la subjectivité ait besoin de la rendre publique. Mais ça, c'est ni la NSA, c'est peut-être un peu les ingénieurs qui favorisent ça, mais nous n'avons pas parlé beaucoup de nous-mêmes. Et je parlais de tablettes de la NSA, de tablettes de Hollande. Il est question aussi de l'éducation, il est aussi de l'éducation et du rapport que nous entretenons nous-mêmes aux technologies, car nous sommes, il faut bien le dire, totalement schizophrènes, où nous entretenons un rapport de gadgets heureux avec les technologies, et puis dans quelques symposiums, nous nous offusquons de grandes figures encore quasi paternelles oedipiennes de la NSA, et à juste titre, mais notre propre part, comme disait la Boétie. Et je terminerai avec ce que tu viens de dire sur unifier les discours. Moi, je ne crois pas à ça. Je crois qu'on peut unifier les exigences, mais que c'est des contre-pouvoirs, ce sont des contre-pouvoirs dont nous avons besoin, et les contre-pouvoirs sont multiples. Il y a des enjeux de surveillance, il y a des enjeux d'éducation, il y a des enjeux multiples, mais ce sont des exigences communes, au moins des exigences communes. Mais que tout le monde défende quantité de points distincts, c'est une petite conclusion. J'ai réfléchi à ce que tu disais, Et je me disais que c'est des exigences communes dont nous avons besoin, des grandes exigences, c'est-à-dire l'humain, est-ce qu'il y a des choses qui lui appartiennent? Est-ce que c'est la temporalité qui a raison d'acquis des choses, ou est-ce que c'est uniquement les développements technologiques, la flexibilité qui perturbe quoi? L'anthropologie fondamentale? Ou est-ce que nous considérons qu'il y a des valeurs non pas lors de réaction, mais il y a de l'anthropologie fondamentale, il y a un rapport aux autres, il y a un rapport d'être ensemble, il y a un rapport du droit, de mettre des limites à l'action humaine, de défendre ces exigences-là. Et puis après, je pense qu'au contraire, c'est aux multitudes, avec leur connaissance, leur curiosité, leur capacité de s'associer, de marquer, de témoigner des contre-pouvoirs.
Je vais passer la parole à Rui, mais juste avant, je voudrais mentionner une chose, c'est que nous parlons sans arrêt de l'individu, de son intimité, de ses pulsions et de l'exploitation de ces pulsions, mais il y a toute une série de chercheurs qui ont mis en avant le fait que le principal effet de la surveillance n'était pas seulement l'atteinte aux individus, mais bien plus la destruction de l'espace public. Et la destruction de l'espace public, si nous prenons au sérieux que c'est quelque chose contre lequel nous devons se dresser, alors je crois qu'il ne faut pas trop rapidement considérer avec cynisme ou avec un espèce de rejet bourdeusien de l'hypocrisie, disons, des moments comme celui que nous vivons ici, parce que les moments comme celui que nous vivons ici sont ceux de la reconstruction d'un espace public, certes très fragile, très incomplet, qui aurait besoin d'un temps beaucoup plus considérable pour produire ses résultats, mais qui est quand même essentiel à nous rendre un tout petit peu moins impuissants face aux problèmes que nous rencontrons. Oui.
Tout d'abord, je vais commencer par ce que tu as dit, Eric. Je crois que je suis d'accord, mais je crois que tu-même, tu as fait un discours unificateur, et un bon discours unificateur, quand tu as dit unifié, quand tu as dit que nous sommes en face d'un complexe étatique, numérique et industriel. Donc qu'il faut combattre dans ce qu'il y a de mauvais à partir de tous les sens, de tous les angles. Et pour cela, on a besoin, et là je me mets à l'envers de ce que tu as dit, d'une multitude d'exigences. Donc il y a 100 ans, on demandait 8 heures de travail, on demandait le vote pour les femmes, on demandait des droits culturels pour les minorités ethniques en Europe. C'était des exigences multiples qui allaient tous dans un sens que j'ai essayé de décrire comme étant de prospérité partagée, droits fondamentaux pour tout le monde et souveraineté populaire. Un rêve qui reste à accomplir, une promesse qui n'est pas accomplie. Et il faut se demander dans chacun de nos domaines, dans chacun de nos mouvements, si ici, dans cette conversation, si on n'est pas en train de faire une conversation qui est entre techno-optimistes, il y a 10 ans, 20 ans, tout le monde, le net va changer toutes les choses, etc. Maintenant, on est tous techno-pessimistes, mais en tout cas, c'est toujours la techno-élite qui s'oublie parfois, quand elle parle des questions de surveillance, de parler du chômeur, de parler du réfugié, de parler de ce qui se passe en Afrique ou dans les autres parties du monde. Et ici, je m'adresse à ce qu'a dit Evan. Because I didn't much enjoy your caricature about empowering the European elite. It has nothing to do with that. What we are talking about is about building transnational rule of law and transnational democracy. With everybody, you know, because when you have the Supreme Court in the United States saying, get a warrant, you do enjoy that, and you like that. And you file cases that go all the way up to the US Supreme Court. But we don't have an European Supreme Court that works like the US Supreme Court. So we would very much like to have something like that. And we you know, yeah, well, you know, we would like to have one better if we can get one better, but at least, you know, it's not, you know, if you're demanding that, and I think it's actually, you know, as I just said to Eric, well, to all of us here, sometimes it's very unself-reflexive from the anti-surveillance, from the, this techno-elite movement that I was talking about, to, not address issues that are being felt by everybody that is not on the network. And then, when you talk about all the mechanisms of democracy and rule of law, the innovative ones, the classical ones, courts with, judges that have studied for decades, or people on the streets demanding for those courts and for rights to be enforced. I don't care if it comes from above or from below. It will come from below and above, but I need my rights to be enforced. So it's not about empowering the European elite. It's about either do we have European democracy, or either we win, maybe from an European perspective, this is what I deeply feel. Either we win this in Europe, in the whole of Europe, or we will lose in Hungary, in Portugal, in France, etc. You're right when you say that the La Cinquième République will, at least has a risk of falling. And I think that when that happens, that puts me in risk in Lisbon, as I've tried to say.
Sure. Let us make our difference precise.
What's the problem about European? Voltaire was European elite.
Good. Great. Let's make our difference.
It's just caricaturing, a side of.
Let's make our difference precise. You
Diderot and Alembert were European elite.
You spoke of the power of this European Constitutional Court as resting in the prestige of its membership. And had that not been there, we would not now be having this dispute.
I will tell you in a few seconds why. Because you have three institutions in the European Union. One is unelected, the European Commission. Okay? It's elected by the governments. The other one, the Council, it's 28 governments thinking, will I be next? If they go after Hungary now, the Latvian ambassador tells, the Lithuanian ambassador tells us, but we would also like to shut down some Polish language schools. Are you going to go after me as well? So these 28 governments will be ineffective. And then you have the European Parliament, where either you have political groups engaging in a mud fight, but that's the best scenario that I see, or you will have the European Popular Party and the European Socialist Party doing a gentleman's agreement and saying, if you don't speak about Hungary, I don't speak about Romania. So an European judiciary seems like, if you have a better idea, I'd like to hear.
Elected.
But now?
Elected.
Well,
don't depend upon
the parliament is elected.
I'm
sorry, you had an American elected Congress during, during the 50s that was ineffective regarding the civil rights issues in the south of the United States. So you always need to have, a plurality of powers and separation of powers. We do have, a hint of elected powers in Europe that can very well do a gentleman's agreement. Don't speak about Romania, which is socialist, and I don't speak about Hungary, which is conservative. And although being a former MEP myself, I don't want to trust only in the European Parliament. I want to have several, I want also to give more power to the European Court of Human Rights. I would like to have an international court of human rights. This is not about, being on the side of the elites or being on the side of the masses. It's being on the side of fundamental rights. So I think it's a caricature that you've done there.
I would like to give the floor to...
I have a direct question about Hungary, so I'll be very quick.
Well, yeah, but
yeah,
I think we need... Jennifer almost didn't talk at all, and I would like to have a viewpoint on, I think in a way, all of us here, we have been spending half our life addressing the legal and political system to try to make a better one, and the rest of our life addressing the citizens to get them moving in directions that would empower the search for these fundamental rights. And so I feel a bit uncomfortable at a turn of a discussion that would present these paths as you say you don't care whether it's one or the other. Let's say that indeed I think there was the choice of a reference of Robert Badinter. I mean, the Robert Badinter of 81 cancelling the death penalty certainly calls for an immense respect, but this is later years fight for fundamental rights has not been shown to have such an energy. But I would like to have Jennifer's viewpoint on how does, in practice, you know, the search for WikiLeaks, the defense of WikiLeaks, it works on these two legs. That is, you explained us how all the financial means of support were cut. I mean, it's not the legal action that has restored them, it's the societal action that has found alternative paths. On the other side, I would like to know, how do you think that it works together? Are there contradictions between the two, or divergence of strategies?
I think they work together, and we can, whether we talk about WikiLeaks or whether we talk about the pushback against mass surveillance, if you don't have, I think filing legal actions and appealing to the European Court has its place. But as we've seen in the UK government just implemented new legislation to basically make legal what previously wasn't. And if you don't have a citizens' movement, if you're not reaching out to the people and engaging people in the pushback, then you're not going to see change, because you have to see it from both ends. You have to have legal actions to hold people to account. And without a mass movement of people opposing surveillance, Parliament will continue to make laws to make it possible. And so I don't think they are oppositional, and in fact always ought to work together.
To leave the last word to people in the audience, we'll take three questions or comments, and please bear with us if there is no time to answer them. We'll try to find it, but I have one here and two there. Never mind the order. Yes, you can start, and then here.
Olá, boa tarde, João Labrinhos, je vais parler en portugais. E vou começar por... São duas perguntas ao Rui Tavares. Ontem eu falei aqui de um acordo entre os Estados Unidos e Portugal sobre a cedência dos dados genéticos e biométricos portugueses. E estive à procura na imprensa e há muito pouca coisa. E encontrei, felizmente, precisamente uma das poucas citações, que é do Rui Tavares, pronunciando-se sobre os perigos de que este acordo, que era supostamente por causa de uma questão de prevenir o terrorismo, estivessem agora a ser usados para reforçar o acordo de vistos, sobre os vistos. Portanto, para facilitar os vistos, Portugal dava os dados biométricos. Gostava de ouvir falar sobre isto, porque realmente eu próprio tenho muito pouca informação. E depois, uma outra questão, também para o Rui. É natural ouvi-lo falar mais sobre o passado, visto que é um historiador, mas gostava de fazer aqui uma pequena provocaçãozinha, que espero não levar a mal, porque o futuro e o presente que vejo em si, de fundador de um novo partido, que é o Livre, em Portugal, que tenho ouvido nas últimas declarações, que pondera, pelo menos eu intuo isso, que pondera uma coligação pós-eleitoral com o Partido Socialista, pelo menos afirmando que não fará uma pré-eleitoral. Se me dissesse, não fazemos coligações, ponto, um bocadinho como faz o Podemos em Espanha, mas eu intuo que, dizendo que não faz pré-eleitorais, que provavelmente então estarão disponíveis. Como é que, conhecendo o António Costa, que é o atual secretário-geral do Partido Socialista, que foi responsável, enquanto Ministro da Administração Interna, pela possibilidade de instauração de câmaras de segurança um pouco por todo o país e pela facilitação disto, e como na Câmara de Lisboa, de que ele ainda atualmente é Presidente da Câmara, nós sabemos o que é que aconteceu com o mandato de António Costa, não é? E com a proliferação destas mesmas câmaras. Por outro lado, o mesmo Partido Socialista foi o responsável pela negociação deste acordo entre os Estados Unidos sobre a cedência dos dados biométricos e a cedência dos dados genéticos dos portugueses. Como é que isto se compatibiliza? Muito obrigado.
Vou falar em português e a minha pergunta vai para o facto de hoje, por exemplo, grande parte da população portuguesa, espanhola, italiana, grega, viver numa situação de desemprego tremendo, em que as populações não têm como prioridade, por exemplo, os sistemas de vigilância, como é o caso, por exemplo, na Alemanha, em que os mídia alemães falam muito exatamente dos sistemas de vigilância. Nos mídia portugueses, espanhóis e italianos não existe grande espaço para esse tipo de debate, porque existe uma prioridade do emprego. Ou seja, como é que nós conseguimos ter um discurso que possa ser de massas, quando hoje as pessoas pedem quase por comida na Europa? Ou seja, como é que nós conseguimos ter aliar estas necessidades básicas de muitos cidadãos, de muito cidadão europeu, com estas exigências de democratização e de contra este estado de vigilância total. Ou seja, o que eu vejo, por exemplo, que é a prioridade dos jovens, por exemplo, em Portugal ou em Espanha, ou até dos mídias em Portugal ou em Espanha, é como resolver o desemprego, como resolver a miséria destes países, como resolver a desigualdade. Ou seja, como é que nós podemos ter um movimento de massas se estas pessoas, a única coisa que pensam ao chegar a casa é: será que eu vou ter emprego amanhã ou não? E como é que as podemos sensibilizar para este discurso sobre a vigilância, quando eles passam a vida exatamente a garantir para sobreviver? Ou seja, como é que se pode fazer então esta ponte?
Yeah, we got the point. Third question here. No, here. And it would be the. I'm sorry, but it will be the last one. I'm sorry, because we.
Je vais parler en français. Je vais être très rapide. Juste un commentaire et ensuite une petite question. Je pense que le danger n'est pas soit étatique, comme on a pu le dire, soit business, soit économique, voire même un danger de déshumanisation des personnes. Je pense que c'est l'ensemble de tout ça qui est le danger. Enfin, ça, c'est juste pour le commentaire. Sinon, ma question, c'est juste comment on peut lutter contre cette surveillance pour la transparence de manière légale, surtout de manière légale. Si le simple fait de dénoncer est illégal, sachant que les informations qui sont dénoncées sont des informations qui sont classifiées très souvent comme confidentielles. Et surtout, ce qu'on entend, enfin, ce que moi je reçois, enfin, ce que je ressens dans la rue, c'est questionner, c'est forcément mauvais, ou parce qu'on critique. Donc, lorsqu'on se pose des questions, c'est forcément mauvais. Enfin, en tout cas, c'est le ressenti des gens qui aiment se poser des questions.
I will take the freedom of answering myself the question from the gentleman there on how can we deal with surveillance when people care about jobs and livelihood. And then I think there was one question that was directly addressed to Rui, even though which is in a way the same than the other one. It is in a sense that it is a question of accountability. Can we trust policy promises when they are contradicted by acts? But on the question of very essential, because in every country the people would try to address issue of democratization, not just issues of technology. They are faced with this urgency of the fight for employment that serves to justify policies that are actually responsible for the lack of employment and for the increase in inequality. So there, sorry for Eric, but I think changing the narrative is really a powerful solution, because we have to go back to the sources. Why is no European politician today in a position to even speak about sharing work? It is something about freeing time, about something that was not just the cultural rights were not just the rights for the minority 100 years ago. They were the rights for every human being to contribute to culture at its best level, and in particular, the laboring class. If we can bring back these issues on top of the agenda, show how the lack of, how an era of brainwashing by making people completely siderated by television has what it has done to our democracies or supposed democracies. When you can see how much we live in a post-democratic and oligarchic situation of government, which is what in Spain, and I guess, I hope also in Portugal, a number of political movements have been able to put successfully on the table, then we can start to see that it is not lost time for jobs and for food to work for the democratization. I give the floor to Rui to answer the question about the coalition. And the third one, remind me, someone will take it, for example.
Então, muito rapidamente, porque creio que vai ser a última intervenção, eu não suavizei o caso da Hungria, pelo contrário, eu acho, como chamei ao Orbán um falsificador da democracia, e acho que é o pior perigo que nós enfrentamos hoje em dia na Europa. Ter várias democracias de fachada que não são democracias reais e que mais tarde se podem desenvolver em algo mais perigoso ainda. Portanto, acho que é muito sério. Em relação ao caso dos vistos, o que os Estados Unidos fazem com países como Portugal e outros é muito simples. Dizem, vocês têm isenção de visto de turismo para os Estados Unidos, não é? Não precisam tirar visto. Nós respondemos sim e eles perguntam, querem manter? Então, se querem manter, agora há mais estas quantas coisas que a gente vai querer receber diretamente. DNA, impressões digitais, etc. E o nosso governo diz que sim, passa aquilo rapidamente pelo nosso Parlamento num mês de agosto ou uma coisa qualquer assim, enquanto a Assembleia está só com a Comissão Permanente, e passa. E, portanto, o que eu, e não só eu, a Ana Gomes e o Carlos Coelho fizemos foi pedir ao menos para ser ouvidos, porque além disso o governo português estava a violar o artigo 4 do Tratado da União Europeia, porque na altura estávamos a negociar o acordo quadro de proteção de dados com os Estados Unidos e, portanto, Portugal estava a enfraquecer a posição europeia. É por isso que eu digo que essa posição pode ser mais forte, porque é a posição de 500 milhões de cidadãos, não é? Com o qual os Estados Unidos não podem, mesmo a sua indústria turística, dizer vamos suspender os vistos desta gente toda, em vez de estarmos a perder países de 10 milhões, países de 5 milhões, países de 10 milhões, estarmos todos a perder perante o colosso dos Estados Unidos. E precisamente a razão porque eu acho que é importante qualquer movimento emancipador pensar em estar no governo é porque queremos ministros que não deixem isto acontecer. E porque queremos ministros também nos países do Sul, particularmente. Eu acho que nós temos a obrigação, perante os nossos irmãos espanhóis, italianos e gregos, de ter um governo anti-austeridade em Portugal o mais cedo possível. E quero que os gregos tenham um governo anti-austeridade na Grécia o mais rapidamente possível, para termos não temos nenhum agora governo anti-austeridade no Conselho Europeu naquelas cimeiras, não é? E, portanto, queremos ter pelo menos 1, 2, 3, quantos mais melhor, para fazer o tipo de barragem que não foi feita nos últimos anos e que nos prejudicou. And very quickly to answer to Philippe's questions, I do think undoubtedly we are in a new era of surveillance. Jennifer has stated it quite rightly. Now we are all suspects before a crime, and that has happened without the kind of debate that democratic societies should have. It's quite clear. And your second question is, if we need a positive narrative in order to turn this around, I do think it's absolutely crucial. We are not going to get there with tens of different reactive moves from our side. We need to have a global idea of the kind of what democratic developed societies should behave.
Before I ask you to reframe the question, I have an important announcement to make, because at 8 o'clock exactly in the Congress hall of Estoril, there will be the projection of Citizen 4, a documentary movie by Laura Poitras, in presence of the filmmaker and with more than a filmmaker, as many people know here. So I urge you to participate and make many friends join you. The hall is much bigger than this room. And well, yeah, but tomorrow, you all know that tomorrow morning, also in Estoril, there will be a live session with Julian Assange starting at 10. And please also, I mean, I'm confident that many people will come. So please, my apologies for noting down your question. Quickly, please.
Oui, oui, bien sûr. Alors, je vais juste répéter la question. C'est comment est-ce qu'on peut lutter de manière légale contre cette surveillance pour plus de transparence, surtout pour plus de transparence, si la dénonciation est très souvent illégale parce qu'on transmet des documents qui sont classés confidentiels. Donc c'est surtout comment est-ce qu'on peut dénoncer ce genre de situation sans que les propres personnes comme Edward Snowden et autres puissent être classées comme des personnes immorales ou personnes illégales, etc.
I'm really glad someone asked about protection of whistleblowers. As I said before, WikiLeaks was designed to protect whistleblowers. And why did Julian create WikiLeaks? Because we have protections the world over to protect journalists from having to reveal their sources, but even journalists can be found in contempt of court and sent to prison if they refuse to reveal their sources. That's in order to protect whistleblowers and the sources like Snowden who bring this material forward. And so WikiLeaks was designed to provide a technological protection so that you can submit material anonymously. Then the journalists don't know who the source is, so they can't be held in contempt. If you don't know who the source is, you receive the material from WikiLeaks, you can't be held in contempt. But also to provide that protection to whistleblowers. Now what Snowden has done, so the whole system around protection has been based upon anonymity of sources. Snowden, by going very public very quickly about his identity, turned that on its head and is forcing a conversation that we need to have, which is, like I mentioned earlier, the Espionage Act has no public interest defence. There is no public interest defence for national security whistleblowers, and all of the legislative proposals that are being put forward, whether in the US or elsewhere, have an exclusion on national security grounds. And so I think Snowden did something that was very brave, and if you go to see Citizen 4 tonight, you'll see that whole process and how and why he came out as publicly as he did. And it does shift the paradigm around how we talk about protection of sources, and is forcing a conversation about law reform, because at the moment none of the legislative proposals on the table would protect him or protect people like him. And it takes people with the courage that he had to put themselves in that level of risk, to put themselves in the way of, he presumed he would be in prison, and he's right, he would have been had he not been given asylum in Russia. And so we have to start having that conversation.
Thanks a lot. Please give a round of applause to the panelists and the speaker. And I hope to see you tonight and tomorrow.